Louis XIV, the Sun King, planned and built Versailles in the 1670s. His heirs extended and improved it. The kings of France claimed to be both divine and absolute. They were supreme monarchs, and they were not the only ones in Europe. At the middle of the 18th century, the great European monarchies were Britain, Spain, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. They appeared grander, stronger, and more solidly established than ever. The sovereigns of Europe seemed to be masters of everything they surveyed, and their glittering courts and splendid new capital cities, like the Vienna of Joseph II, proclaimed their status throughout Europe. Maria Theresa, the Austrian empress, and the other monarchs were not only the political chiefs of their countries, they were also at the center of cultural life. Catherine the Great supported Voltaire, and many of the best scientists of the age, and the Habsburgs sponsored Mozart and other composers. The monarchs seemed totally secure. But between 1750 and 1800, Europe exploded into revolution. France suffered the greatest revolution of all in 1789, but Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Western Germany, Northern Italy, and Poland were also thrown into turmoil. Revolution even crossed the Atlantic to North America, the Caribbean, and into South America. The age of revolutions had begun, starting with the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and going on to the theories of Karl Marx. The splendor and pretensions of the 18th century courts concealed fundamental weaknesses. None of the monarchs had absolute power. They depended on the nobility, the church, and the professional classes for taxes, soldiers, justice, and the provision of officials. And in some countries, like Austria, groups of princes and nobles exercised considerable power over the rulers and could block any reforms proposed by the monarch. In 18th century Poland, the nobles actually gathered together to choose a king by election. They could, as individuals, veto any candidate for the throne, or stultify his policies, or even force him to abdicate. By the late 18th century, this reduced Poland to a state of internal chaos, and its geography made it very vulnerable to the outside world. Its near neighbors were Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and they had swallowed it up by 1796. Poland disappeared as a state, though not as a nation, for over a century. In most European countries, there was stiff opposition to centralization by the crown whenever it was proposed. It implied vastly increased levels of taxation. In America, the British provoked the first great revolution when they attempted to increase taxes, but Britain survived almost completely unscathed. George III was accused of trampling on Magna Carta when he attempted to assert royal authority, and mischievous English radicals like John Wilkes stirred up riots. The Rights of Man, Tom Paine's famous book, celebrated freedom and equality and supported the revolutionaries in France. A few Whig politicians, led by Charles James Fox, also sympathized with radical aspirations. But England was not a revolutionary country. The aristocracy governed along legal and parliamentary lines, and a new middle class was allowed to develop and prosper. Political agitation did not have much attraction. Besides, English kings like George III were not without resources. British monarchs had no financial crisis, even after the defeat in America. In France, under the Sun King and his heirs, things were different. Until the French Revolution, France remained chopped up into dozens of different jurisdictions, all cutting across each other and making sensible government impossible. During the 1780s, Louis XVI commissioned ministers like Necker to try to correct this by expanding the tax network and preventing his exchequer being emptied by the clergy and nobility. It never worked. The heirs of the Sun King were perpetually financially embarrassed. The nobles and the clergy were the main targets for the tax gatherers, and that provoked trouble with the local representative bodies in which they sat, the Parlement. In 1788, they were suspended. The Parlement appealed to the people, and unrest everywhere caused the king to capitulate. In this contemporary illustration, the three estates of nobles, clergy, and middle class are seen proceeding to Versailles for a panic meeting of an ancient body, the Estates General, which the king had summoned. The Estates General had not met since the creation of the French absolute monarchy in 1614. It went out of control immediately. The third estate, the bourgeoisie, soon constituted itself as a national assembly in defiance of tradition. The exchequer was empty, the army was disintegrating, the king was indecisive, and a mighty new force had come into existence. The poor people of Paris, known as the sans-culottes. Bread riots in Paris in 1789 caused great suffering, and political agitation continued. The government organized a National Guard, composed of men who were sufficiently well off to pay for arms and uniform. But these men cooperated with the mob, not with the crown, and on the 14th of July, 1789, the sans-culottes and the National Guard captured the Bastille, the great royal fortress that dominated eastern Paris. Bastille Day has been celebrated in France ever since, and it's also celebrated far beyond France's borders. The end of royal absolutism was seen as the prelude to universal liberation. The joy was intense, as shown in Jean Renoir's film La Marseillaise, made in 1937.
Amour sacré de la patrie, conduit soutien à nos braves vengeurs. Liberté, liberté chérie, combat avec ses défenseurs, combat avec ses défenseurs.
The English poet, William Wordsworth, spoke for many people when he celebrated the revolutionary impulse at that time. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. The forces of the crown joined enthusiastically with the rebels. The revolution in Paris in 1789 stimulated the first sustained lower-class urban movement in all Europe. But great hopes turned to disappointment. The red flag of revolution was soon besmirched with blood. Why did this happen? In 1790, it looked as if France might become a constitutional monarchy. But the Queen, Marie Antoinette, constantly encouraged her brother, the Austrian Emperor, to intervene, to reinstate Louis XVI as the absolute monarch. In 1792, a coalition of powers attacked France from all directions, and that coincided with another economic crisis and with provincial revolts. In Paris, power passed to out-and-out revolutionaries, the Jacobins, who abolished the monarchy in December 1792. The king was guillotined the next month. The Terror was proclaimed, with Paris full of spies and Robespierre as their leader and inspiration. The piles of heads mounted up beneath the guillotine. Clergy, parliamentarians, constitutionalists, nobles, but the people suffered worst. The Terror, though modest by later standards, shocked civilized opinion throughout Europe. From Paris, the revolution and the guillotine spread throughout France. In July 1794, Robespierre received a taste of his own medicine. He was arrested and executed, together with 80 others. In September 1792, at Valmy, the Revolutionary Army halted the Austrians, and in 1793 the Austrians, Dutch and British were defeated in Belgium. In 1795, the Austrians were brilliantly defeated in Italy by the youngest French general, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had a capacity for inspiring his men, and he was able to spur them on to almost unbelievable exertions. A march, fully laden, of 100 miles in 3 days, fighting most of the way, carried him and his men to victory over the Austrians in Italy. In 1798, he took an army to Egypt, with a view to marching on India to threaten the British. But the French fleet was destroyed by the British, and Napoleon returned to France laden with the spoils of the Pharaohs. In 1789, French territory extended only as far as the Alps. By 1798, Napoleon had added dependencies in Italy, the Netherlands, and the territories previously occupied by Austrians and Prussians. In 1799, Napoleon carried out a coup d'etat and made himself first consul. Napoleon's regime was based on military force, and eventually a secret police as well. Within 2 years, Bonaparte proclaimed himself sole consul and consul for life. Then, in 1803, to show the monarchists that their cause was lost, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, an extraordinary scene, to which the Pope was summoned as a witness. Napoleon's mother refused to be present. She muttered skeptically, "I wonder how long it will last." Napoleon counted as the great miracle man to emerge from the revolution. The Napoleonic eagle became a symbol of victory, and to any problem he had one answer: win a battle, build up his armies, encourage his troops. Throughout this period, France was at war with most of the other European powers. In 1805, Napoleon defeated the Prussians and the Austrians at Austerlitz. The following year, he defeated the Prussians at Jena. In 1807, when he made peace with Tsar Alexander at Tilsit, he was master of the largest European empire since ancient Rome. An enlarged France ruled over dependencies in Western Germany, the Netherlands, northern Italy, and even the northwestern part of today's Yugoslavia. In all these areas, he introduced the revolutionary reforms which had transformed French life. Although most of the buildings in Paris post-date Napoleon's reign, the organization of much of European society still reflects what he achieved. Secularism, equality before the law, the Code Napoleon, and French institutions of government and education all stem from that period. On continental Europe, Napoleon was secure, but the British remained his enemies. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 had destroyed the French fleet. Napoleon took the decision to launch a continental campaign against the British. He intended to cut off all their trade with Europe. He invaded Spain in 1808, and he launched an invasion of Russia in 1812. In both cases, it was a disaster, for his armies found themselves facing guerrilla warfare in the midst of hostile populations. In 1812, the Russian disaster settled his fate. Of 600,000 men who had invaded, only 50,000 struggled back to the Polish frontier. A contemporary cartoon showed a giant Russian Cossack snuffing a tiny Napoleon figure like a candle. Even death, Napoleon's friend, bade him farewell after the Battle of Leipzig. He was sent to Elba but returned. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he was decisively defeated. Then he was sent to the South Atlantic to die on the island of St. Helena. Napoleon launched a legend that lasted for the next 2 generations. It was linked with the revolutionary legend, for he was only too obviously the creation of the Great Revolution. The legend came to life almost at once, as the victorious Allies set about remaking Europe. At the Congress of Vienna, they attempted to restore the old Europe, with Prussia dominating northern Germany, the Austrian Empire sprawling across southern Europe and into the Balkans, and Russia swallowing most of Poland. France and Spain were restored to the 2 Bourbon dynasties. Europe was now consciously ruled in a reactionary spirit. A contemporary wrote that there was a standing army of soldiers, a kneeling army of priests, and a crawling army of officials. There was now a desire to return to the old order. Liberals and nationalists were imprisoned. Censorship was imposed. The continental great powers banded together in the Holy Alliance, which was supposed to intervene anywhere in the world if revolution struck again. There were several revolutionary outbreaks on the continent of Europe and elsewhere. Outside Europe, the British Navy had more or less total command of the seas and used it to intervene often enough in the cause of liberation. In Latin America, they supported Simón Bolívar and the liberation movement of the 1820s, and the result was the creation of independent Latin American states like Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and, after prolonged fighting, Brazil. British statesmen and orators sympathized greatly with liberal and nationalist causes, provided they were in other parts of the world. This made Great Britain the object of much admiration on the continent, where her combination of money, liberty, and power struck many observers as an ideal model. To outsiders, British society appeared to be the epitome of civilization. The aristocracy and the gentry lived a splendid and much envied life which was based on a stable rural economy. Castle Howard in Yorkshire is a monument to the sense of security of its owners and builders, who began work in 1700. Chatsworth in Derbyshire, the home of the Dukes of Devonshire, admirably represents the stability and continuity of British life. Certainly the British managed to avoid revolution. Somehow they combined the highest degree of economic change with sustained political balance. English agricultural and political stability meant that the Industrial Revolution gathered speed without impediment. At first it was water that drove the mills, and the textile mills of England were the first mass production system in the world. England became the most modern of the world's countries and pointed the way for everyone else. The foundries and ironworks of Great Britain could feed on rich natural resources. Coal and iron ore could be transported wherever they were needed without difficulty as a result of developments in communications. A unified national market came about, initially because of the canal system. The canals were great feats of engineering, almost nautical versions of today's motorways. The railways developed later. All this happened very suddenly. In the early part of the 19th century, Britain experienced a very large-scale industrial change. Mechanization became common. Canals and railways snaked across the land, and the industrial cities developed their factories. Often enough, conditions in British towns were very grim. In Bristol and elsewhere, there were riots in 1831. Already in the 1830s, people talked of two nations, the England of the rich and the England of the poor. But British governments attempted to improve conditions in the factories and towns, and the rise of Chartism in England in the 1840s brought political reform rather than revolution in terms of parliamentary change. On the continent, things were different. Overpopulation and economic crisis combined with the growth of an educated populace. Ramshackle and reactionary governments were faced with visionaries who dreamed of efficient nation-states. In the 1840s, successive crop failures caused misery in Europe's expanding towns, and there was an explosion of political feeling all over Europe. 1848 was called the springtime of nations, because of the violent nationalism which came to the fore in Germany, Italy, Hungary, as well as in France. But the legacy of 1848 was not discerned immediately. The most significant result of 1848 was the publication of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. It reflected an idea of class war and utopian progress which was derided at the time, but it sowed the seeds of subsequent revolt. By 1905, revolutionary socialism was ready to challenge even the greatest reactionary power in the world, the Tsarist Empire in Russia. A revolution which Eisenstein portrayed in his film about the naval mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. Urban riots and rural uprisings in Russia in 1905 were the legacy of the age of revolutions. It was that rebellion and its brutal suppression by the Tsarist authorities which led in the end to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and to the revolutionary impulses of our own century.